Today, we start the prehistory of the modern Arab world, so to speak. That is the 3 centuries preceding the 19th century. This is a period in which what we now call the Arab world was part of the Ottoman Empire. And that is why we're studying the Ottoman Empire. I personally am fascinated with the Ottoman history in and of itself, irrespective of its relationship to modern Arab history. And I can design an entire course, not only one lecture, on the history of the Ottomans. But I will not inflict this on you. We're going to cover the Ottomans in a very, very quick way, with one question in mind, which is the question I started with last week, which is, why do we study the Ottomans? What is the relevance of this period on modern Arab history? Let me dramatize things a bit further. Let me tell you that if this course were taught about 30 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, most likely there wouldn't be any reference to the Ottomans. If you were an Egyptian or a Syrian or a Lebanese, and sometimes even a Turk, going to school in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and having a history of your country, there will be no mention of the Ottomans. They will occupy maybe one line. And instead, let's stick to Egypt. You will learn about pharaonic history, about Islamic history, Egypt being conquered by the Arabs in the 7th century. You will learn something about Egypt under the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Tulunids, the Fatimids, the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, and suddenly a break, and you jump to the 19th century with Muhammad Ali and the founding of modern Egypt. Between the Mamluks and Muhammad Ali, there is 300 years. And you will have learned about these 300 years in 2 or 3 sentences in a very dismissive way, saying the Ottomans were backward, a very stagnant period in Egyptian history. Indeed, it was this stagnation in particular that caused Egypt to lag behind. So at a time when Cairo was the seat of an empire that extended from Sudan to Hijaz and to Syria under the Mamluks, when Egypt was conquered by the Ottomans, Cairo was reduced to a mere city within a far-flung empire, and there was no investment in science or technology or literature or arts or architecture, and that is what caused Egypt to lag behind. This is why when Napoleon came in 1798, Egypt was so easy to conquer. So it's a period that is typically dismissed and not taken seriously. But in the past 2 decades or more, 3 decades, now more and more scholars are studying the Ottomans, and they're simply saying, we cannot dismiss 300 years as if nothing happened to them. This is not 10 years or 20 years, it's 300 years. These 300 years must have had some impact on Egypt or Syria or Lebanon or in Iraq or Turkey, the countries that were once part of the Ottoman Empire. 300 years is such a profound, long, important period that cannot be easily dismissed. I'm trying to tell you that history itself has a history. What you learn in books, what you read in textbooks, itself changes with time. This book that we have is a result of research that was done in the past 20 years. If you had picked up a textbook on the Middle East 20 years ago, it will be very different from this. So it's not only mathematics and physics and chemistry that push the frontier of knowledge. Even history and the way people think and write and do research about history advances from one year to the other. So this is just a methodological point. Now, let me then delve into Ottoman history and say something very, very brief about this huge empire that spanned a huge, long period of time. So I think as a way of introduction, I would say the following, that first of all, these are different pictures of Ottoman art, Ottoman calligraphy. This is Mehmed the Conqueror. This is the Sulaymaniya Mosque. Different artifacts and pictures from the Ottoman Empire. Now, what and who are the Ottomans? Well, ethnically, they are Turks. Ethnically, if we think about the Islamic world, if we think about Islamic civilization in its heyday, we're thinking about basically three ethnic groups. Obviously, the Arabs, for obvious reasons, are at the core of what Islamic civilization is, the core of the rise of Islam. The Quran is an Arabic text. The faith appeared in Arabia, so this needs no further explanation. But Islamic civilization also was a result of very significant contributions by Persians. And Persians, that is modern-day Iran. And Persians, especially in the philosophy of government, of rule, the ideas of kingship, and one cannot think about the institution of the caliphate without taking into consideration ideas of government, of rule, of kingship that were dominant in the Persian part of the Islamic world, that is the eastern part of the Islamic world. Also philosophy, also poetry and literature. And then we have the Turks, another ethnic group that appeared in the Islamic world starting from the 11th century, and made a very big show with the Ottomans. It's difficult to represent what I just said visually, so I thought I would represent it by putting together these three texts that appear to be written in the same language, but these are three different languages. This is Arabic, this is Persian, this is Turkish, written in the same Arabic script, but just like Portuguese and English are written in Latin script, they are different languages. Arabic is closer to Hebrew than it is in syntax, than it is to Persian. Turkish is closer to Finnish and Korean than it is to Arabic in, again, syntax. So it's, but these are three different languages. My idea is that we're dealing with the Turks, the third ethnic group that played a big role in the history of Islam and Islamic civilization. We are talking not about a small state, we're talking about an empire. In a sense, even a world empire. Not a small one, but one of the four largest empires in the Middle Ages. And here is an architectural expression of these four empires. Clockwise, we have the Mughals in India. Those of you who have been to India, someone, yeah. Have you been to Humayun's tomb? Well, the precursor to the Taj Mahal. That's Humayun's tomb in Delhi. The Ming in China, the Ottomans basically in the Mediterranean, and the Tudors in England. There's a fascinating novel by Salman Rushdie about the relationship between the Ottomans and the Tudors, published about 10 years ago, called The Flower of Florence, I think, The Rose of Florence. Can't remember the exact title, but These are contemporaneous civilizations coexisting with each other, huge empires, very powerful, very significant. Their impact is very profound on the areas and the countries that they and the societies they ruled. Now, so who are the Ottomans? We're talking about this group of people now. They start not in our part of the world. This is just to give you an idea of the extent of the Ottoman Empire. A huge part of what was known of the known world at that time, a very rich part of the world, the Mediterranean basin, was effectively an Ottoman lake by the 16th century. And most of what we now call the Arab world had become incorporated into that Ottoman Empire. Now, interestingly, the Ottomans, the rulers, the tribesmen, the people whom we later call Ottomans, did not actually start here. This is not where they originate from. They start way further east, kind of here, in the central steppes of Asia. I mean, we are here. This is the Mediterranean. And this is the area in which the Ottomans literally roamed. They were not settled. They are nomads, Turkic-speaking nomads, originating in Mongolia, and we're talking about now 10th century, maybe even 9th century. And for some reason, we don't have the history, we don't have records, we don't have written accounts of this. There's a population pressure. Within this area, and they are seeking new lands. They're seeking pasture, especially for their animals and their flocks. And instead of going this direction in the east, most likely because this is a center of civilization itself, China, they move westwards. Hundreds of thousands of them, over not 1 year or two, but over decades, if not centuries. And they start moving westwards, and in their march, they encounter the lands of Islam. Islam had already spread into this area, including into Persia. And on their march, they convert to Islam, convert, interestingly, to Sunni Islam rather than Shia Islam, and eventually settle in around the Mediterranean. We'll see where exactly in a minute. So this is the very, very distant origins of the Ottomans. This is where they come from. They are nomads, that is Bedouins, if you want. They are tribesmen. They are not settled in cities. They roam around, very much like the Arabs of Arabia at the time of Islam, but unlike the Arabs of Arabia, they do not inhabit a barren desert. They inhabit these central steppes of Asia. This is a kind of a typical landscape of this region. It's mountainous, but not necessarily very steep mountains. It's a steppe, it's a plateau. But the interesting thing, again, if you compare it to the Arabs in Arabia who domesticated the camel, those people are masters of horses. They are, even as you can see from the picture here, I mean, these are modern Mongolians, but the very ancient Turks were also very astute cavalrymen, people who mastered the horse. That is their beast of burden, that is their means of transportation, and this is what allowed them to travel huge distances. Medieval Turkish and Persian miniatures are replete with images of Turkish archers on horseback, And indeed, it is as military men on horseback that the Ottomans, that the Turks first made their way into the Islamic world. It's mostly as mercenaries, that is hired soldiers, hired by many rulers, the Abbasids in Baghdad, the Ayyubids in Egypt, and later on the Mamluks, hired these men because of their expertise as warriors, especially as cavalrymen, as people on horseback. Now, as I said, throughout the 11th, mostly the 11th to the 13th centuries, these people march further west, and eventually they settle in Anatolia, what is now Turkey. This huge plateau that was part of another empire, was part of the Byzantine Empire, which is a Christian Orthodox empire ruled from a very ancient city, Constantinople, that covered a huge part of the world, including Egypt. But by the 11th century, the empire, as you can see, the Byzantine Empire, had been reduced to this area in red because these Turkic-speaking Sunni Muslims had settled here in Anatolia, pushing the frontier further west. I'm simplifying things because we're not talking about one of the empires that these Turkish-speaking people had established. I want to simplify things here, just to say that these people who 2 centuries earlier had originated from the central steppes of Asia had been coming here, settling into these areas, eventually taking them over and establishing their own state here, pushing the frontier of the Byzantine Empire further west. I have a question here, one here.
I figured it out.
Okay.
I was just wondering, at what time were the Mongolian invasions to the destruction of Baghdad?
Actually, I don't know. Much earlier, but this is a very good question, because I think one of the ways of thinking about this is that this is not a Mongol invasion. This is not the Germanic tribes sacking Rome. These are not destructive people, and that is a fascinating question. Like the Arabs centuries earlier, who expanded mostly as military warriors, descending on settled countries like Egypt with its very fertile lands, and Syria, not destroying cities, not razing cities to the ground, unlike the barbarians in Europe when they descended and sacked Rome many times, or the Mongol invasions which sacked Baghdad and burnt the library, the famous image of the Tigris changing into black because of the color of ink of the books that were dumped into the river. We don't see this. With these Turks, whether the Seljuks first or the Ottomans later, we don't see this kind of destruction. Something happened, and this is what I want to explain. I want to explain what is it that the Ottomans and later, and the Turks first, and then the Ottomans did in their expansion. And I want to explain it in some detail. But this is a good question. The comparison between the Mongols when they invaded Baghdad and the Ottomans when they invaded, as we will see in a minute, Constantinople. Simon, you had a question.
I was just wondering, so this is prior to this Ghazi movement?
Yes, yes. So I will explain this. I will explain this in a minute. Yes.
And what drew them to Islam? Are there any sources that explain?
No. it's definitely, they were not conquered by Islam. In fact, they are the ones who descended on Islamic lands individually, as you know, or collectively as tribes. I haven't studied this period, but they were not forced to adopt it. They were not conquered and or forced to do so. The interesting thing is that they established themselves in small principalities, small independent tribal congregations around various small centers of sedentary urban life here and there. And it is one of them, one particular principality up here in the northwest corner of Anatolia that proved to be the most successful one. It was a principality founded by one of these Turkish-speaking tribesmen called Osman, and his descendants came to be known as the Ottomans. So it's a small principality in a small town called Sugut, up here, somewhere here. That was the most successful one. And then eventually he started establishing his hegemony over neighboring Turkish-speaking Muslim principalities and expanding into Anatolia and then crossing over into Europe and spreading, and he and his descendants spreading their influence, eventually founding an empire. Now, I want to explain something about the process in which this happened. Simon mentioned this interesting ethos, the Ghazi mentality, which is mentioned in your book, which in Arabic would be called al-Jihad fi sabilillah. This is basically what it is. The notion that now that we are Muslims, we have a religious duty, a holy duty to spread this faith further. The notion of, in Arabic/Turkish, would be called ghazi. You know, the notion that you are on a religious duty to wage war in order to spread the faith. For a long time within Ottoman studies, that is how the early Ottoman expansion was explained. Religious fervor, population pressure, the appearance of enormous abundance of wealth very close by, so why not? You expand, you build an army, and spread your territory, your faith, your means of culture and means of life onto neighboring territories. Over the past 20, 30 years, this Ghazi thesis has been challenged. And why? Because we are discovering so many documents about all kinds of alliances, treaties, mixed marriages, trade partnerships between people on this side of the border and others on that. And that many people here, Christian Orthodox, villagers, traders, who wanted the Ottomans here. So that now we are revising, historians are revising their understanding of how the Ottomans spread. Again, I'm trying to give you a taste of what we historians do. We do not memorize. We interpret based on the facts. And I want to give you an example from our readings. Someone asked me the other day, what is a primary reading? And we have a number of primary readings for this week that I'll try and explain how we deal with them. Any questions so far before we continue the story? Yes.
I find it a little bit difficult to understand how, over a period, they were marching on the 22nd century. How were they still a distinct ethnic group? Why wasn't there any integration within the lands that they...
No, they did. It's a very good question, which the question for those of you who haven't heard it, over 2 centuries, are we actually talking about the same people? Haven't they been integrated into the areas that they intermingled with? And of course, the answer is yes, they have. The very fact that they converted to Islam is one very big example of integration and adaptation. And I'm going to mention many other examples of adaptation. In fact, that is the thesis of my lecture, that you cannot explain the success of the Ottomans either in their early expansion phase or in the time of their final settlement. We cannot explain an empire that lasted for 6 centuries except if we say that it had adapted, it had changed, it had become flexible enough, or it was flexible enough to accommodate many challenges, temporal challenges as well as geographic challenges. An empire that started in the central lands of Asia, landlocked, is a very different one from an empire that oversees some of the busiest maritime lanes in the world, the Mediterranean. This is a very different terrain, so to speak. It's a very different frontier than the one that their ancestors had encountered. Being on horseback doesn't help you here. You have to do something else. So adaptability is one key factor of understanding the Ottomans and indeed understanding any successful empire, including the American empire. The challenges that states encounter are key to understanding how successful different countries, different governments, different regimes, different empires are in accommodating these challenges. So that's a very good observation, and we will see how they faced, what are the challenges that they faced, and Saif? Tariq, sorry.
So you said that the Egypt lagged behind under the Ottoman rule. So was it the same with other countries, or was it different?
Yes, but this is a later explanation of the Ottomans. So let us postpone the explanation before we just introduce some more facts, and then we come back to the interpretation later on. So they settle here and then cross over here. But this big city, Constantinople, which was one of the largest cities in the known world at that time, which had been a capital of the Byzantine Empire for 1,000 years. Now I want to repeat this. I want you to just imagine what it means to have 1,000 years of history behind you. This is what the Byzantine Empire was. The city of Constantinople, founded by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, 4th or 5th, I'm not sure, 5th century. And a huge city, a huge metropolis with magnificent buildings, and a seat of government for 1,000 years. Of course, I mean, much bigger than Cairo, much more prosperous than, not much bigger, but significantly bigger than Cairo, and Baghdad, and Damascus. It's a very privileged city. And the Ottomans are here, and now they are here, and they have their eye on it. And the first capital is here in Bursa, and then they attempt many times to capture Constantinople, and finally in 1453, this is just again a map of where they started, how they expanded, and how they crossed over into Europe, and this is the city here, Constantinople, that they have their eye on. They couldn't take it, and finally in 1453, this man, a very young sultan, I think he was 20 years old at that time, is the one who finally succeeded in laying a siege on Constantinople and capturing it in 1453. A very important date in the history of the Byzantine Empire, because effectively it ceased to exist. There is no longer a Byzantine Empire, an empire that had existed for 1,000 years, simply ceased to exist, and now its capital is taken over by this new player, the Ottomans, and we'll see what they do with it. this is an artist's imagination of how the city was taken. I don't know whether you can see it clearly, but this is a very modern artist's imagination of it. They capture the main church, one of the most famous churches in the buildings, not even churches of the world, and convert it into a mosque. Yes.
But you said that they were more peaceful, like they didn't do any destruction. But isn't it not a way of destruction to capture
Church.
a church and convert it into a mosque? And same goes to the Constantinople. If it had a civilization and it had a history, why were they like interested in going there and starting all of if they were peaceful?
Who has an answer?
I think he said that they weren't destructive at first because they were just trying to find new lands to spread in, but then when they were trying to have expansions because of the Ghazi principle, I think, so that's why they were motivated by Islamic motives and taking other lands and having them under their authority.
Does that mean that they changed, like their mentality changed after living to Islam, or?
They certainly did, and I will give concrete examples of this. But you raise an interesting question of, isn't this an example of destruction?
I'd say, like, seeing how strategic Constantinople was, and they wanted to make it their own capital of the empire. If it had churches and it was supposedly going to be an Islamic empire, they'd obviously change the churches to mosques. It's not so much destruction as it was just, adaptation, or like, just changing it to fit the
So there's a difference between destruction and adaptation. Simon?
Also, I think just
No, go ahead.
just like for the time, I mean, like destruction was, burning the city to the ground and salting the earth, so nothing could grow there. So I think like it being converted into a mosque, like for that time, is just unprecedented of like a sense of like adapting to new situations. And also, I think that just of like how important Constantinople was as a trading point towards the Black Sea and like being a huge center of wealth. Of course the Turks are pretty much any empire at that time would want it as a capital.
Yeah, there is a difference between raising a city to the ground and subjecting its population. Obviously, the church lost out. The Byzantines lost out. But there's a difference between this and enslaving a population or raping their women or razing the city to the ground, which, history has shown many examples of this. I'm not saying that the Ottomans were religiously, they were religiously tolerant up to a certain degree. They're not informed by multiculturalism and equal existence of, that's not where they come from. So it's a different, but they are not at the same time people who came in and destroyed the city. And as Simon is mentioning, with the Reconquista in Spain and its mosques, many of the mosques were transformed into churches. The famous mosque in Cordoba has a Gothic, not a Gothic, but a Christian church springing out from its center. Next week, I'll show you a picture of it. An interesting picture of transformation. So this is, not unknown, not unheard of.
I like to think that it was, I think, it's haram to convert a church or to take it and make it a mosque. And I know that Muhammad al-Fatih was a very religious man. So why did he do that? Maybe it was a symbol, had a political rule.
No, this raises a big question. This is an empire that supposedly is an Islamic empire, and they're practicing many non-Islamic practices. I would make this argument about many other so-called Islamic empires. including the Abbasids and the Umayyads and many other people. So let's keep this question in mind. How Islamic is it? How useful is it to refer to an empire as an Islamic one, for that matter? We say Islamic civilization. What is the contribution of Islam in Islamic civilization? How useful is it to explain an empire or a building, for that matter, as Islamic?
Yeah, I understand this.
No, I see your point, that this is not sanctioned by Islam, the conversion of a church into a mosque. But he prayed in it the minute he conquered it. And this is much later, you know. This is beautiful Ottoman calligraphy. The Ottomans were famous for their calligraphy.
I think though that it was converted in the interest of expansion and the interest of attempting to make Islam sort of like or Constantinople a hub for Muslims.
But it's also a hub for trade. You see, this is the point. You know, the Arabs before them and the Ottomans now realize that these are very rich areas that they have now conquered. They are rich because of the economic activities that take place therein, especially trade. They know that for them to continue to succeed, they have to protect these economic activities. So in fact, you start wondering, is it really the Ghazi mentality and spreading Islam? Or is it economic, strategic, military benefits that motivated them? And in my view, the answer is always an fusion between these two things. Just like the Arabs before them, 6 centuries before them, who entered and made all kinds of compromises and irreligious practices, non-Islamic practices. But one thing that they have in common is that they were very aware of the productive base, the agricultural, commercial, productive base, and they were very clear on, very keen on maintaining the productivity of the countries that they settled in. I want to fast forward a bit, and this is the extent of expansion. This is the largest extent. They kept on expanding after taking Constantinople. You see the northwestern borders here. They came very close to capturing Vienna. In fact, they besieged Vienna 3 times. This is one famous small miniature about the siege of Vienna. And the interesting thing, just to think about it, is that a huge part of what we call Europe now was part of the Ottoman Empire. The entire Balkans, a huge area of what came to be known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire later on, was part of the Ottomans. Indeed, the Ottomans were first an Asian empire, then a European empire, and only later an African one. And for a long time, after they captured all of this area this is a very heavily populated part of Europe. And for at least 2 centuries, the majority of the population of the Ottoman Empire was actually Christian, Orthodox, not Muslim. The majority became Muslim when they captured Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, way later. Does anyone know when Egypt became part of the Ottoman Empire? 1517. So for 2 centuries, the 2 centuries between the founding of the empire and capturing Cairo, Syria, and Baghdad, the empire is mostly based here, and the majority of the population and the majority of the economic wealth, the agricultural base, is in the Balkans, is in this part of Europe. So for 2 centuries, we're talking about a Christian empire, as far as the population is concerned, but a Muslim one as far as the elite and the government is concerned. So it's an interesting mix. By the time of the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, in he died in 1566, not 1580. was one of the largest empires the world had ever witnessed. Not only this part of the world. It's a huge area falling under one rule. So let us try and piece together. So this is just a very simple overview of the expansion of the Ottomans. As we have been pointing out, with this expansion came many, many challenges. We want to identify some of the challenges. We've already mentioned some of them, and to try and make you think about the genius of the Ottomans in maintaining a huge area like this. The first thing that I want you to think about is that this is an empire. Now, I want to ask you, what's the difference between an empire and what we call a nation state? Those of you who studied political science. Between an empire, Ottoman, British, Roman, Austro-Hungarian, empire as such, and a nation state.
Nation state usually means when a few people with the same background, with the same culture, live together in a certain place or in a certain country. That's a nation.
Yes.
So a nation can be also everywhere. From the Egyptians living abroad everywhere, they're all a nation, the Egyptian nation. So a nation state is the nation that lives inside a certain state.
And an empire.
An empire is when you have a central. I don't know exactly. It's under the level. When there's a central power holding a lot of countries together. But so they're all within certain
not a lot of countries. They're not yet countries.
I mean, segments.
Regions. Or, okay, so.
They encompass different ethnicities and different religions.
So this is the biggest difference. There are many differences, but the biggest difference is that an empire very often is a multi-ethnic political entity. So whereas a nation state that is the creation of modern times, of 19th century onwards, is when France is French, Britain is English, Germany is German, Italy is Italian, and each ethnicity, the Italians want to have their own. I'm sorry, I didn't switch this off. The Italians want to have their own country. The Germans want to have their own political state, and so on and so forth. With the empire, it is not the case. With the empire, with an empire we have different ethnicities living under one political rule. So in this case, can you think about the ethnicities or religions or linguistic groups that we are talking about?
You have the Arabs, you have the Persians,
the Europeans,
Turks,
vampires,
Arabs, Persians, Turks, Jews, Orthodox Christians. We are mentioning ethnicities and religions now, which is fine.
Yeah, for religions, there's three main monotheistic faiths in the various denominations within there.
So let's talk about ethnicities first. Persians are not here. You see where the border is? Persia was never subjected to the Ottomans. So Iran, what we call modern Iran, Persia, was not part of. In fact, they were enemies for a long time. One of the strongest enemies of the Ottomans were the Persians here. Muslims, these are Shi'is, these are Sunnis, but not mostly about confessional differences. These are just different empires vying for influence over the area between them. So it's Arabs here, Turks here, and Europeans there, Kurds, various parts of this area, Kurds, different ethnicity. In terms of religions, we have Muslims, we have Christians, and we have Jews, especially in important centers, in Constantinople, in Salonika here, very important Jewish center. So we have, especially after the Reconquista in Spain, many Jews ended up left Andalusia and left Spain and ended up living in Ottoman land. So it's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual empire. So that's one big feature and one big challenge.
You have to deal with all the people.
How do you deal with them? So that's a big question. Like we mentioned earlier, these are not multi-culti people. That's not what they are doing. It's not they're not informed by multiculturalism, and we will accept all ethnicities on the same footing. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we are intolerant. We do not tolerate other religions or other ethnicities. There's a hierarchy of ethnicities and definitely a hierarchy of religions. So the main faith of this empire is Islamic, and the non-Muslims are protected, dhimmis. And the interesting thing is how the central state in now called Istanbul, not Constantinople, the new name that the Turks gave to the city, how the central authorities in Istanbul deal with these people. It's mostly through their leaders, through the church, let's say, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, the Grand Rabbi of the Jews. So he's the one who mediates the relationship between individual subjects of the Jewish subjects or Christian subjects and the central state. That is a system that is in Ottoman studies called the millet system, a Turkish pronunciation of the Arabic word millah, which means an ethnicity or indeed a religion. So each ethnicity is semi-autonomous. They have their own schools. They have their own courts. They have sometimes their own sources of finance. They're not completely isolated, but they are more or less semi-autonomous. And each of these communities have their own leader. And that leader is supposed to run the internal affairs of this community on behalf of its members and mediate the relationship between that community and the authorities in Istanbul. That is what is known as the millet system. Separate, semi-autonomous, a very efficient way of managing the multi-ethnic empire without unifying them. I know you have questions, but I want to add one last point here before moving to another one. I mentioned a key term here. I said subjects. I said the Jewish subjects, the Christian subjects, the Muslim subjects. So I want to ask you to reflect on the difference between, like the question we asked, what's the difference between an empire and a nation state? What's the difference between subjects of an empire and citizens of a nation state?
Well, a citizen is a person who automatically has rights. The state protects that person, gives them certain rights. And
It comes to the people at the back end.
But okay, so the citizen has rights, but also has duties. Whereas the subject of an empire is really just protected, and it's not, for example, required to join the military, or is not required to do certain things that the state expects of its citizens.
So the subjects have rights and duties, rights and responsibilities, whereas that's the citizens, whereas subjects have the rights of protection and little else.
Yes, and I'm not sure, but I think the subjects are not allowed to be, for example, in administrative positions or to engage in political activity in return for their protection and giving them certain interests. But whereas a citizen can actively participate in the politics of the country.
Yes.
Of the state.
Of the state of the country. Yes. Suggestion?
I just wanted to add something, that the subjects, they were called the Ra'iyah, and it had to do more with the classes, like the hierarchy of the society.
Those of you who know Arabic, what is the origins of the word ra'iyya etymologically? The flock, literally. It means the flock. So you are protected like sheep. You cannot be a shepherd. You cannot be a leader. You cannot be part of the government. You are protected. So you have some rights, right of life, but you do not. So this is a function not only of the Ottomans, all pre-modern empires, all pre-modern political entities, political polities, were not founded on the idea of citizenry. That is a result of the Enlightenment. It's the result of the French and American revolutions. It's the idea. And what's the key term here? What is the basic difference between subjects and
citizens? We mentioned many.
Rights.
sorry?
Rights.
Rights
And
freedom and what? Equality. Being a citizen immediately brings together with it the idea of equality before the law. There's no difference between a Christian and a Muslim and a Jew, or for that matter, why quotation marks?
Does not actually happen.
No, what happens is something but the theory. I'm talking about the theory. It's interesting. What's your name? Nada is using quotation marks because she wants the quotation marks to be removed. She says, we want the idea of equality to actually be exercised on the ground. We know it is not exercised. But the principle of equality is what defines citizenship. Citizenship means that all members of the polity have the same rights and the same responsibilities. No difference between men and women, no difference between different members of different faiths or ethnic groups. That is not what we're seeing here, definitely. It's not based on equality. That is why we call them subjects, ra'iyya. In fact, that system is based on maintaining distinctions between the elite, which was called the askari class, and the ra'iyya, the flock, the subjects. They do not have the same rights or privileges.
But wasn't there still ways that the ra'iyya could become part of the...
With difficulty. With difficulty. But there is, the level of upward mobility is very limited. And many of the ruling institutions are founded in a way that maintains that distinction.
I was just wondering how they compared to, say, other empires of that time, like the Byzantines, or were the Byzantines had a lot less social mobility?
I think all of them share this feature together. The difference is one of degree. As you can see, I'm constantly stressing the fact that there's nothing specifically Islamic about this. This is something about the pre-modern empires, pre-modern polities as such, including Islamic ones, as I'll mention on Thursday. But I want to mention a couple of things. One of them is the thing we mentioned earlier, in terms of adaptability. So 2-3 centuries earlier, these are warriors on horseback. Now that they settle in Anatolia and control huge parts of the Mediterranean, this is now their frontier. This is now the area, the terrain, quote unquote, that they have to deal with. And the result is that the Ottomans transformed themselves 3 centuries into their history, so to speak, into being a huge and powerful maritime empire. This map is an Ottoman map. It's a map drawn by one of the most famous cartographers, navigator and cartographer, Piri Reis, in the 1520s. It's a map that was discovered in the 20th century. and it occupies pride of place. If you go to Istanbul in the Topkapı Palace, you'll find it there. And it's a fascinatingly accurate map, as you can see. It's recognizably modern. And it's based on a huge amount of naval expertise and experience and knowledge that the Ottomans had accumulated. So not only are they very crafty shipbuilders, but they also know what to do with their ships. The continuation of this map is even more fascinating. Because at the very end of the map, the lower left corner of it, you see this shore. Can you identify, recognize? There is one here, there's one there. Can you see? This is South America. This is Africa, and this is South America. And that is the shore. This is Africa, and this is the modern satellite image of South America, and you can see how accurately they got many things about the geography of South America. So this is again a testimony to how successful the Ottomans were in transforming themselves from being a landlocked empire 2 centuries ago to being a very powerful maritime one now. I will stop here. I have many more things to say about the way they adapted to many of the challenges. I don't have time to go forward, but I want to just tell you one last thing, if you bear with me for one more minute, about Thursday. On Thursday, the lecture that you will see, unfortunately, I won't be here, but I'm recording a lecture to continue this very short theme of adaptation and adaptability and reform. But I will highlight one aspect that you will not find in your readings. It's something that is based on my own research and something that I think is very significant for the lasting influence of the Ottomans on us. In fact, I won't be here on Thursday because I will be in Amsterdam giving a lecture on something very similar, which is Sharia, Qanun, the courts, and the very interesting innovation that the Ottomans did on that front itself, on that level itself. How it is that they understood Islamic law, and what is it that they did in terms of implementing Sharia. This is a very political thing, as we know. All Islamist groups, left and right, want to implement Sharia. The lecture I'll be giving in Amsterdam on Thursday, not here, is what does it mean to implement Sharia? Well, the Ottomans teach us something. They perfected, in my mind, the process of implementing Sharia through Sharia courts. When I said at the beginning of the lecture that we as historians have sources that now enable us to revise many of our ideas about the Ottoman Empire, it is mostly through the Sharia court records, the Sigillat al-Mahakim al-Shar'iyya. In the Egyptian National Archives in Boulaq, close to the Conrad Hotel, I think most of you know the Conrad Hotel, don't know where the National Archives is. We are talking about 5,000 registers of the Sharia courts from Egypt that covered the entire period of Ottoman rule. If you go to Jerusalem, if you go to Damascus, if you go to Aleppo, if you go to Istanbul, you'll find similar depositories. This is the result of the Ottomans perfecting this institution of the Sharia court, al-Mahkama al-Shar'iyya, and preserving the records. Now we have access to these records. It's fascinating sources, fascinating, illuminating sources about daily life in the Ottoman Empire. So this is what I'll be talking about on Thursday.
Is it going to be on
on Blackboard? So I will upload the